You're welcome to the Gavel. I'm Linda Akibe. On this week's edition of the Gavel, we examine President Buhari's request to the National Assembly for restructuring of 23.7 trillion naira ways and means advances given to the federal government by the Central Bank of Nigeria. Now, President Buhari made the request to the National Assembly in December last year. Now, the ways and means advances from the CBN to the federal government is for emergency funding of delayed receipt of fiscal deficits. But this request has been met with disapproval from the Senate and some financial analysts. There was disquiet on the day the matter was tabled before the Senate during plenary on December 28 last year, as some legislators were of the opinion that the request is unconstitutional as the spending was not authorized by the National Assembly. We bring you the report of that day's Senate proceedings.
Federal legislators take a day from the annual Christmas and New Year holiday to attend to some crucial legislations and functions before 2022 draws to a close. One of such is a request from President Muhammadu Buhari for the approval of restructuring of 22.7 trillion naira ways and means advances given to the federal government by the Central Bank of Nigeria within the last 10 years, in addition to 1 trillion naira to be collected as fresh domestic loan. The President, in a letter read by the Senate President Ahmed Lawan last Wednesday, explained that ways and means are advances from the Central Bank of Nigeria to the federal government for emergency funding of delayed receipts of fiscal deficits.
81 to 83.
However, a federal lawmaker is averse to this request from President Muhammadu Buhari.
Mr. President, Section 81, 82 of the Nigerian Constitution, 81 to 83, states clearly how expenditure can be made by the government. One of it is through budgeting. The next is through supplementary budget as provided in the Constitution. Now, I don't know where the law comes from, where we have to spend money or restructure expenditures through ways and means.
Distinguished, excuse me, please, just let me say something. There is nothing before the Senate now. There is nothing. Technically, the report needs to be presented, and then you can raise your issue.
Mr. President, the report cannot be presented because we have no laws in the land of Nigeria that covers anything called weight.
No, why the report should be presented is for us to know what happened.
Senator Piafi is unhappy at the progression of events and raised voices fill the air, mostly from opposition senators who are against the report.
Listen. Yes.
You have to sit down. Your opposition.
Chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance attempts to present the report, but lawmakers once again raise their voices.
Please allow him to land. Allow him to land, please.
Efforts by the Senate President to make his colleagues back down is unsuccessful, prompting him to call for a closed-door session to resolve the matter. Nearly an hour later, the private session ends and Senate announces its resolutions on the Ways and Means request.
The restructuring of 22 trillion 719 billion of ways and means be stepped down for further legislative action.
The Senate President sets up a special committee to summon the Minister of Finance, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, the Central Bank Governor, and heads of other relevant agencies to provide details on approvals and expenditure made from the 22.7 trillion naira. Meanwhile, the Senate passes the Finance Bill, which proposes key reforms to specific taxation, customs, excise, and fiscal laws through the amendment of several tax laws. The list of acts to be amended in the Finance Bill include the Capital Gains Tax Act, the Companies Income Tax Act, Personal Income Tax Act, Petroleum Profits Tax Act, Stamp Duties Act, Value Added Tax, Public Procurement Act, Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Act, as well as Customs, Excise and Tariff Act. Sponsors of the bill say it is intended to enhance tax equity by bringing more economic sectors into the tax net and ensuring a fairer distribution of revenue receipts to all tiers of government. However, a member of the House, Honorable Onofiok Luke, raises concerns that certain amendments in the finance bill will not address the hardship faced by Nigerians.
The finance bill has to do with the macroeconomic policies for 2023. And then that is going to affect the lives of Nigerians. Already, the economy and the situation from globally to nationally has affected the lives of poor Nigerians. And so any action we are going to take to lay a foundation for government expenditure for 2023 should consider leveraging and then mitigating the hardship that Nigerians are facing.
Nevertheless, the House of Representatives passes the finance bill.
The Debt Management Office issued a press statement on January 5th to explain Nigeria's debt stock of 77 trillion naira by May 2023. The agency stated that what jacked up the debt stock to 77 trillion naira was the Ways and Means advances of 22.72 trillion naira, which represent funds already spent and is the largest source of increment. Now, we had a chat with two financial analysts, Mr. Kalu Aja and Paul Alaje, to understand the legality or otherwise of this expenditure and the implications on Nigeria's economy.
When it comes to Ways and Means, it's a form of advance, and advances that the federal government receives from the central bank. So these advances, they go in form of giving payment where government is expecting some revenue. For instance, government may be expecting revenue from crude transactions and it has not entered the accounts, the federation account, let alone federal government taking its share. So federal government can run to a bank, in this case, the central bank, which is the government bank, to collect an advance. But according to the Act, it must not be more than 5% of the central bank's of the federal government's previous year's revenue at any time. So nobody has raised concerns about Ways and Means until recently. Last year, November, it was published that 6.3 trillion in 10 months was collected by federal government. That is from January to October. The federal government has collected almost equivalent when you prorate the expected revenue for last year. When you prorate it, that's what government collected in Ways. So the caution around Ways and Means have been thrown into the air. And government just saw that as another loan means without, and you know, because it's an advance, it's more like quote and unquote another overdraft of some sort. You don't go to National Assembly for such because you know you are anyways going to pay back almost immediately. Your spending will still be within what the National Assembly has approved. But that is not what we see. In fact, when you read the publication by the Debt Management Office even wants to integrate it now as a proper loan, which means the monies President Buhari has spent, we now need to go back and look at what the deficit was. For instance, for that 10 months I mentioned, over 6 trillion should be part of deficit. So when you look at it, you know we have a big issue in our hands. Over 77 trillion. And this is not the end of President Buhari's administration. This is January 2023. What will it be when it gets to May 2023 or the 29th of May 2023? It's a big concern. For me, I don't think the Ways and Means should be removed because it's a form of support to any government. But any government that wants to use Ways and Means must adhere to the rules that guide it. Another thing where this became a big issue is that 23 trillion every year, because MPR, you know, people are quick to say, let central bank raise MPR. MPR is over 16%, about 16.5%. And the Ways and Means rate is +3 of MPR. So when you say 16.5%, plus 3, 19.5, approximately 20%. What does that mean? It means that if federal government does not borrow any money, on Ways and Means alone, we are going to add 4 trillion naira every year, approximately. But you see, what we must understand is that before central bank introduce any program, such program already have a plan. For the plan, there are some amount of money that has been earmarked. The projections are there for the plan. It's different from Ways and Means. Except and unless we are saying that central bank should start printing money. Because it's the interest, which most people have not even paid from most of those development loans. Because when people collect such loan, they believe that it's my national cake. A lot of education needs to go into it. Banks can go bankrupt, but I don't think it will be completely abnormal for a central bank to go bankrupt. Because if you don't pay 23 trillion back, and the components in this is important we explain. It is not the whole 23 trillion that was borrowed. What was borrowed is far less than 20 trillion. Maybe 15 or 18 trillion. But because the loan is cumulative in nature, when you add the interest to it, it keeps growing from...
it's been over 10 years.
Over,
10 years.
So you see what that has amounted to. So it's a huge concern.
So what recourse does your National Assembly have in responding to this request?
First thing I would advise National Assembly to ask is, where did you spend the money?
If they've asked that question and we've not had a response.
Yes, if you have borrowed last year alone, in 10 months, last year, 2022, 6.3 trillion, you budgeted your fund, what you wanted to use, and you have presented to us that you have an account that is balanced, quote and unquote. Because if you had borrowed from us, if you have told us that you are going to finance your budget with debt, which was approved and you collected, that's on one hand, and you are going to generate revenue, which you claim you generated part, and the remaining you brought back to us as what? A supplementary budget and was approved. This 6.3 trillion for 10 months is still missing. It has not been explained. So it's either you are telling us that your expenditure was more than 6.3 trillion, which is not what you retired. So we first need to know where these monies are. That is on one hand. On the second hand, it will be injurious to Nigerian states to keep paying 19.5%. So if you say that the central bank should review MPR to about 14% or about 12%, and the policy says 12 plus 3, so 15%, what will happen to inflation? Recall that central bank did not just wake up to start increasing MPR. Central bank increased MPR because of inflation. In order to tame inflation, you've seen currency redesign. To control money supply, inflation has refused. It became stubborn at over 21%. So if at a time where global inflation is increasing and local inflation is also increasing, you now, because of mismanagement of funds, review MPR is a big issue. So in that wise, it's either there is moratorium for a period of time, for the federal government or DMO that is now weighing in this issue. And I think that DMO was not aware when all of this transaction. You can ask the DGDMO. But I'm wondering
how that is possible.
I think it's
in 10 years.
I think it's very possible from the statement published by the DMO. I'm not saying that she may not know, but I don't think she was aware officially. Officially. I doubt if she was aware officially. I doubt. I have my reservation. But I doubt if the DMO was aware officially. Because you cannot be writing to the public for public consumption now, on the 10th year, when 23 trillion naira could not be fully explained. It's a big issue. And I also think that we also need to ask the Central Bank of Nigeria, why did you get the approval to give beyond 5% of the previous year's budget? Because if you have acted based on that, it would have geared federal government to do more in terms of revenue. And if you want more advances from the central bank, then generate more money. It always there 5% per time. So when all of these have been done, first of all, I think federal government will need to pay back, because that will adversely affect the central bank position and the value, the worth of our central bank. It will affect central bank. What are the no options? Don't print money. If you print money as a nation, will become worse off. Because when you print money, it's going to have impact on inflation. Already, central bank is printing money, banks, even commercial bank, quote and unquote, and I'm just speaking professionally. But when it comes to creating new money from nowhere, then the naira we have in our pocket, which you need about 200 naira of the unit of naira to purchase $1 at official window, today is worse off. It's worse off because of devaluation. It's worse off because of printing of the same money. So we cannot continue to do the same thing and expect a different result. So these are questions that National Assembly must ask as a body and must also ask at the committee level.
You're welcome back to the Gavel. We had a chat with the financial analyst, Mr. Kalu Aja, to also discuss the ways and means advance given by the CBN to the federal government.
The Nigerian laws, i.e. the Constitution, does not talk about ways and means, but ways and means are a legal way to borrow. It simply means overdraft. There's nothing constitutional about it. It's more of a banking term. So the federal government is allowed, according to the Central Bank of Nigeria's Act, to borrow up to 5% of past year's revenues. And this is because, of course, you can't get revenues from day one. So you can borrow 5% of last year's revenues, spend that, then you pay it back fully in the year in question before you then borrow next year. It's a stopgap, just an overdraft that is available. It's passed by National Assembly, so it's in that law. But in terms of the Constitution, it's not there. But it's legal way for every government, it happens all over the world, to borrow money from the central bank to meet short-term obligations before the actual budget is passed. Yeah.
How would you want the National Assembly to handle this issue? Because President Buhari is still insisting, when he signed the 2023 budget, that he would want the National Assembly to approve this Ways and Means request.
The problem is that it's already happened. So the DMO, the Debt Management Office, said these funds have already been spent. Yes. So that's the problem. You can't leave it on the central bank's balance sheet. You can, but it's not supposed to be there. So because it's already spent, the National Assembly were asleep. I mean, this had been revealed by the past central bank governor, Sanusi. When it was 4.5 trillion, he raised the alarm. The cows have left the barn, as they say. So we're talking about how can we ensure that going forward, those funds are properly accounted for and do not cause monetary dislocation. That's really what we're talking about now. But in terms of action to be taken, the president has them in the bank. He has already spent it. So we're walking back now. Yeah, that's the problem.
So would you say that this is a problem of oversight, that the National Assembly did not properly oversight the CBN in this regard?
Correct. Both the central bank and the federal government. The National Assembly was asleep. You can't spend an amount in excess of your foreign reserves, 23 trillion, and the National Assembly will say they were not aware. That is, they were asleep on the wheel. And this administration has been very, very, should we say, innovative in how they have gotten funds outside the National Assembly. You look at something called the PIDF. All they've done is to take the dividends, the dividends of the Nigerian liquefied natural gas, put it into a fund, call it PIDF, and then do projects. This also is part of the same CBN extra budgetary spending, where they are taking funds outside what has been approved either by appropriation or by supplementary budget, right? So the National Assembly has been very lax in its oversight of spending.
The budget deficit for the 2023 budget is 11.34 trillion naira. Does this concern you, even though we've seen the finance minister assure Nigerians? Does this concern you?
Yes, it does. Just to be clear, right, a budget deficit is actually a quote-unquote good thing. You can spend more than you make. You can borrow to spend if you're building infrastructure, if you are building, assets or products that in future will repay themselves. So when you take a debt, it's front-loaded consumption. If you are borrowing, like to buy a mortgage, you buy your house, you live in your house, right? The problem with Nigeria's deficit is what we're spending it on. We're spending deficit on importing PMS. So we're importing consumption, right? Number two, we're spending the deficit on repaying debt. We're not even talking about salaries. We're not even borrowing to pay salaries. We're borrowing to import PMS, to repay debt. Then you talk about salaries. Then you talk about building roads and bridges. This is the problem of the deficit. So the deficit is basically we're borrowing to import to consume, i.e. PMS. So it's a big issue that we haven't sorted out in 8 years. So it's not going to stimulate the economy. It's going to take wealth out of the economy. It's going to cause inflation. It will not create jobs. So big problem there.
And we also saw one very interesting, in one of the sessions between the finance minister and the Senate Committee on Finance, she did disclose that we also borrowed to fund the social investment program.
Yes, if I recall, that was a borrowing from the World Bank, I think about $500 million. But those loans are, should we say, development loans. They are long-term. The rates are not as high as what the Eurobond loans. The problem is with our foreign debt, right, is the Eurobonds, because they're in a different currency, and the US dollar, the rates are going up. So what's happening? We're earning in dollars. We take all that dollars and then we pay for subsidy. So we have no dollars left. The central bank of North says there's no inflow from the sale of crude oil. So how do we pay back Eurobonds? We're paying back Eurobonds from our non-oil, which is in Naira. So we're taking Naira to get dollars to pay back Eurobonds that are in dollars. So the structure is wrong. That's what's happening to Ghana. So rates have gone up. So if you're in different currency apart from the dollar, you struggle to repay those dollar debts. So we have a structural debt problem.
So would you say we have a revenue problem or a spending problem?
It's a spending problem because you never have enough revenues. No country has enough revenues. Economics is a study of choices, scale of preference, because you never have enough revenues. So if Nigeria spends money on fuel importation, that's a choice that we made. We don't have to spend 100% of that. We could spend 5 or 10%. We took a choice to spend to import PMS. We took that choice. So it's a spending problem. Fuel subsidy has taken 100% of the revenues that the NNPCs to pay to Nigeria. That's a choice that we made. So it's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem.
Last year, actually, to be specific, the Senate Committee on Finance began this process of meeting with government MDAs to look at their revenues, to see how to plug these revenues, to remove some of them from taking funds, from appropriation from the federal government, in a bid to just to shore up revenues for the country, particularly for those revenue-generating agencies. Do you think this will go far in tackling the revenue issues, the shortages we have in the country?
I believe so. I think the big problem we have in Nigeria is we have lots of commissions, MDAs that simply draw funds, right, and make no returns back, i.e. And even when they don't draw funds from the treasury, they make no redemptions back to the treasury, to the TSA. So you have a big MDA, they make billions in revenues, then they spend billions in overheads. So essentially, the Nigerian public is funding MDAs and all that. That's where the problem is. If a president puts a microscopic, and you put a review on those MDAs, you can raise trillions, and it's very easy. How does the private sector do it? You tell the CEO, I'm going to cap your expenses, but I want to double your revenues. If you can't do it, leave.
Finally, Mr. Aja, so the 9th Assembly is winding down. We're expecting the 10th Assembly next year. What agenda would you set for the 10th Assembly in terms of approvals for loan requests from the President, even in handling this loans and means issue going into 2023?
Yeah, so in terms of what they should do, they should tighten up the language around how the government can borrow, right? There's a big loophole in that is CBN borrowing, the ways and means, is that part of the revenues of the government? Because the NAS law says that the president must come to National Assembly, present his income and expenditures, and also present supplementary requests should he want to spend outside the budget. But it's a bit silent on what you do with Central Bank of Nigeria, because the law already says 5%. What happens if that law is broken? So tighten that loophole and say, not just Central Bank of Nigeria, you can't take any funds from any MDA and spend if you're the federal government. It must go back to the Constitution, go to the Consolidated Revenue Fund, and then it is appropriated. It must go back to that. It's already there in the Constitution. So let's tighten that up.
This is where we call it a day on this week's edition of The Gavel. If you have any views on any of the issues discussed, please email us on thegavel@channelstv.com. Thank you for staying with us and see you again next week.